Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to our Bread for the Journey series. We are this year exploring the topic of a new Oxford movement. It was a delight to have Dr. Hannah Mattis with us last week to kind of give us the Benedictine roots of the Oxford movement and what that might mean for us today as we consider what it might be like to have a new Oxford movement. And this evening we have Father Sam Keyes. He is an instructor at St. James, a boarding school, Episcopal boarding school in Hagerstown, Maryland. I knew it was up there in northern Montgomery County. And also working on his PhD at Boston College. Should have that finished by the spring, hopefully. So, but it's a pleasure to have you, Father Keyes, with us this evening. Thank you.
All right, I've got a little handout that I'm going to, if I could just pass this around. There we go. Just got some quotes on it that I'm going to be referencing. It's lovely to be here. I actually, in this room, I mean, I have a great memory of, I don't know when it was, maybe, 10 years ago at some point when I kind of came here for a low mass. Do you still do the 6:55 or what time is it in the morning? Yeah. 6:45. It was really early. And
Tomorrow morning, in fact.
Yeah, coming in here. And then when I was in seminary, one year the American Academy of Religion was having a meeting in Washington, and I convinced some of my classmates to come over here with me to solemn mass, and they were, I was kind of in awe of the whole thing. So this place has a very good place in my memory. So my topic this evening is public theology, which is itself a provocative description that many these days wouldn't quite know how to handle. Theology in public. And this is assuming we've actually heard of and know something about what that word theology means, which rules out, I think, most of my students, sadly. And it's about as odd to most 21st century Americans as sex in public. More so, actually, because we're kind of okay with sex in public these days, or at least a lot of talk about sex in public and a lot of sexual language and imagery in public. The idea that the study of God, theology, or the study of other things in relation to God might have anything to do with the world outside of my individual private experience has become taboo. Now, there's nothing substantially new about this situation, which is why we turn to history. So I'm going to begin with something of a poetic prologue, and then move on to look at the initial public controversies of the Oxford movement, represented by John Keeble's Assize Sermon of 1833. And then I plan to offer some possible implications and even a plan of action and response. So, poetry, description, prescription. Here we go. I begin in an unexpected place, maybe. John Donne's Holy Sonnet 18, written around 1617. Forgive me if this seems like a digression, but I am actually an English teacher now as well as a priest, and so I do as much, that's a big part of my day, so I can't help it. So this is number 1 on your handout. Show me, dear Christ, thy spouse so bright and clear. What? Is it she which on the other shore goes richly painted, or which robbed and tore laments and mourns in Germany and here? Sleeps she 1,000, then peeps up 1 year? Is she self-truth and errs, now new, now out war? Doth she, and did she, and shall she evermore on 1, on 7, or on no hill appear? Dwells she with us? Or like adventuring knights first travel we to seek and then make love? Betray, kind husband, thy spouse to our sights, and let mine amorous soul court thy mild dove, who is most true and pleasing to thee then, when she is embraced and open to most men. So I, for one, find the conceit here as disturbing as it is beautiful. For Donne, the church, the bride of Christ, is somehow most true when she is promiscuous, open to most men. I've struggled with that image for a long time, and I'm still not exactly sure what to make of it. But Donne's almost desperate claim at the end comes from his obsessive questioning in the first part of the poem. Christian division, the kind of division that Donne sees, is scandalous. And here, what we see is not so much an ecclesiological scandal as a personal scandal. For Donne, it's very personal. Holy Mother Church, who is supposed to represent the bright and clear light of Christ, is in the modern age less a shelter for restless souls as the place where souls become restless. We can only find her in Donne's double entendre at the end through a kind of betrayal. I doubt that Donne's soul-searching represents the mainstream English consciousness in the 17th century, yet it suggests the ways that Anglican identity, even less than 100 years after the English Reformation, has not yet fully extricated itself from crisis mode. Where is the church? Who is the church? For Donne, that wasn't fundamentally a question of whether to be Catholic or Protestant, though that was an important question for him, but a question of experiential knowledge. Where can the lover find his lost beloved? Is she to be found at all? Near the turn of the 19th century, at the height of the Romantic movement, William Wordsworth wrote another sonnet suggesting something of the pathos of his own age, and this is number 2 on your handout. Some of you probably know this one. The world is too much with us, laden soon, getting and spending. We lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. The sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. Lovely. So here in Wordsworth, we find much of that same spirit that came to characterize the Oxford movement. For Wordsworth, what is distressing is less the church, as it was for Donne, than the banality of modern life and its detachment from the power and the beauty of nature. But also for Wordsworth, and this is the important thing, the banality of modern life is implicitly identified with the English church. It is precisely in the context of Anglican supremacy, that great via media, that, quote, we have given our hearts away and lay waste our powers. And so he longs to be a pagan with creed outworn. Not a true pagan, mind you, but a pagan in emotional sensibilities. He wants to see and feel and know the world unfettered by the religious, political settlements and compromises of English history. While Donne flirts with an image of a reformed church, Wordsworth wonders if the solution lies outside the church altogether. Wordsworth is something of a secular saint, but it's precisely this romantic frustration with English culture that animates the early Oxford movement. There we find a deep kinship of ideas, a feeling, a suspicion, even an anger that we have lost or squandered the best of our intellectual and aesthetic inheritance. So I now turn to the key moment on July 14th, 1833, when Keble delivered his assize sermon at St. Mary's in Oxford. This is the moment that John Henry Newman says kind of began the whole movement. That simmering frustration with the status quo, represented so keenly by the Romantic movement, was coming to a head following the Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1829, which finally repealed the Test Act in 1672, requiring that members of Parliament be communicants in the Church of England. in itself, all of this government activity seems a good thing. Certainly today in this country, we kind of recoil at the idea of having a religious test for office. But before Catholic emancipation in 1829, Parliament had effectively served as the lay synod of the Church of England. And at this point, there loomed the possibility, and we can paint it starkly in this kind of unlikely nightmare scenario, that the Church of England would find itself governed by a group of, shudder, Roman Catholics, anti-Anglican nonconformists, and even atheists. That had not happened, of course, but this new secularized Parliament was considering a dramatic restructuring of the Church of Ireland at the time, a move that would be perfectly sensible in its own terms for all sorts of reasons, but that struck many Anglicans as a kind of slippery slope of state meddling in the church. So Keeble's sermon that day in 1833 is called National Apostasy. Now, with that title, it might be tempting to imagine that Keeble and his Oxford colleagues envisioned a kind of hostile takeover. But Keeble worries less about villainous Jesuits or atheists than he does about the indifference of normal people. So here we come. This is quote number 3 on your handout from the sermon. So one of the most alarming omens of an apostate mind in a nation as a symptom is the growing indifference in which men indulge themselves to other men's religious sentiments. Under the guise of charity and toleration, we are come almost to this pass, that no difference in matters of faith is to disqualify for our approbation and confidence, whether in public or domestic life. So I read that for the first time and I thought, wow, this feels like something that we could hear today. So then he adds, and this is moving on to number 4 on your sheet, I do not now speak of public measures only or chiefly. He's kind of trying to avoid being too overtly political. Many things of that kind may be thought, whether wisely or no, to become from time to time necessary, which are in reality as little desired by those who lend them a seeming concurrence as they are in themselves undesirable. But I speak of the spirit which leads men to exult in every step of that kind, to congratulate one another on the supposed decay of what they call an exclusive system. Again, those kind of lines really kind of jumped out at me. This kind of self-congratulating of how we've kind of overthrown this kind of formerly exclusive system. Again, I think it's important when we read this to avoid a kind of easy, cynical caricature of Keeble and his fellow Anglican clerics as men who simply do not wish to see their own cherished power fall apart. But what is at stake is less some principled Anglican superiority or supremacy, nor is it, despite some occasional patriotic reference, a kind of principled superiority or idealized England or Britain. What's at stake for Keeble, and what later on marks this moment, this sermon in Newman's memory, is the start of the whole movement. What's at stake is the very nature of religion. What is dangerous and even apostate in 1833 is not that the Church of England should suddenly cease to be the center of the world. For Keeble and the rest, they know that it isn't and shouldn't be. Indeed, they are not sure that the existence of the English Church can be deemed a success at any point in its history. But rather, they think that what is apostate is that the question of the Church's status should be so easily dismissed and just totally recategorized as another matter for partisan disputation and parliamentary control. In other words, they resent and protest the idea that with the wave of a hand, the government, a temporal government, with no definite ecclesial ties, again, they could be anybody, they don't have to be Christians anymore, that government could presume to define, even if implicitly, what the church is. And here in a nutshell is all that Wordsworth and his English Romanticism feared, that a group of pragmatist politicians should decide to expand their authority beyond questions of normal government, taxation and governance, into the realms of the soul. They presume to tune a nation to certain frequencies of theology and ecclesiology as if these were purely questions of prudential management rather than ultimate truth. In other words, Parliament thinks that it can legislate on this matter because it's a matter of indifference. And it's a matter of indifference because Parliament says it is. For Keble, this situation of spiritual and theological apathy makes an interesting allegorical comparison with that of his chosen text from 1 Samuel. And this is number 5 on your handout. This is the text that he chooses as the kind of the theme of his sermon. As for me, God forbid that I should sin against the Lord in ceasing to pray for you, but I will teach you the good and the right way. His sermon begins, in fact, with an investigation into whether Israel and England can be compared with one another based on this passage in Samuel. So that verse in Samuel comes as part of the prophet Samuel's farewell discourse to Israel after he has appointed Saul as king, which is the institution of the monarchy in Israel. For Samuel, that move to monarchy is a failure on the part of God's people. So, remember the people say, we want a king, we want a king. And Samuel says, it's a bad idea, but I'm going to give you a king anyway. That move represents a lack of trust in God's provision, and more importantly, Israel's desire to be like the other nations. And that's the phrase that kind of Samuel uses, and that they use. Hey, look, all these other countries, they have kings. We want a king too. Rather than to be a people set apart, consecrated to the true God, and ruled by this God alone. So Keble ends up affirming the comparison with modern England. And he writes, this is number 6 on your handout. That portion in particular of the history of the chosen people, Israel, which drew from Samuel, the truest of patriots, the wise and noble sentiment in the text, must ever be an unpleasing and perplexing page of Scripture to those who would fain persuade themselves that a nation, even a Christian nation, may do well enough as such without God and without his church. Men must own what is clear at once as to plain, unsophisticated readers, that this first overt act, which began the downfall of the Jewish nation, stands on record with its fatal consequences for a perpetual warning to all nations, as well as to all individual Christians, who, having accepted God for their king, allow themselves to be weary of subjection to him and think they should be happier if they were freer and more like the rest of the world. It may strike many Americans, and it struck me this way, as odd that this strong biblical criticism on monarchy should be the chosen text to use in the context of a state church, an established church, headed by a monarch, which is losing its grip on power. Now, Keble is no Republican. He really thinks that monarchy and a state church is the best way. But for him, the point is not that monarchy itself is bad, but that any government which seeks to establish itself apart from the wishes of God sets itself up for disaster. Israel wanted to be like all the other nations. And so for him, the United Kingdom has revealed in its new policies, the new policies of Parliament, a shift in authority away from its traditional understanding of itself as a nation state ruled by God. So he kind of asks, what is the point? What's the point of retaining an established church if the nation no longer considers itself to exist under divine authority? If the nature of divine truth is just a matter of, in his phrasing, indifference? For Keble, this is an open question, one that he wrestles with for the remainder of his life. Some scholars argue that Keble actually viewed church disestablishment, so a totally independent Church of England. He thought that was a real possibility, and so he saw the Oxford movement's purpose as at least partly, a kind of preparation for that possibility. And as he saw, the church had become too entangled in the state, and if the state no longer properly understood its role vis-a-vis the church, then the church would have to take matters in its own hands and prepare for its own future. But the primary response for Keble to this society's indifference is twofold. And so here he draws straight from what Samuel says in that verse: to pray and to teach the good and right way. In other words, to use Keble's language, two things: intercession and remonstrance. And so now I'm on quote number 7, which is also where I get my title. Thus, not only by supernatural aid, which we have warrant of God's word for expecting, but even in the way of natural consequence, the first duty of the church and of churchmen, intercession, sincerely practiced, would prepare them for the second, which, following the words of Samuel as our clue, we may confidently pronounce to be remonstrance. I will teach you the good and the right way. Remonstrance, calm, distinct, and persevering, in public and in private, direct and indirect, by word, look, and demeanor, is the unequivocal duty of every Christian according to his opportunities when the church landmarks are being broken down. So that sermon in itself in 1833 was Keble's first opportunity to follow his own advice. He preached at the opening of the Summer Assize Court, which, as you may or may not know, is basically the opening of a court. I mean, there are visiting judges who were in the congregation. But perhaps more importantly, it was heard by the clerics and theologians of Oxford, many of whom saw it as an opportunity and a call to rise up from their lethargy and to care about what was happening to the church. And from there came the Tracts for the Times and that whole Catholic revival that spread all over the Anglican world. And I know that you all are going to be talking more about that in coming weeks. That indifference that Keble saw in 1833 has, I think I can say this without controversy, that indifference has more fully come of age in this 21st century. We can note the correspondence in Keble's concerns with the way that Western thought has developed its notions of the secular and the religious. So my high school students today, I teach kids from basically 8th grade through 12th grade, and they come to me with very clear ideas about what these things mean, religion. If you are religious, you believe in God. If you are not religious, you don't. And this is for them purely a matter of indifference, which is to say, a question in the realm of opinion. It never occurs to them that God's existence, much less the whole series of questions and consequences that might follow from it, might be actually a question of the real, what's real. For them, it's like the fact that some people like chocolate ice cream and some people like vanilla ice cream, and some people don't really like sweets at all, so why can't we just stop arguing and get along? As an historical theologian, I cringe at that reductive definition of religion to belief in God. And I usually tell them, to sort of blank stares, but I tell them that if this is the definition of religion, then Christianity is not a religion. And neither are really any of the major world religions. But we can see pretty well where this reductive definition comes from. It comes from a whole history of causes, not easily summarized or pinned on one bad guy from the 14th or the 16th or the 19th centuries, both in Western intellectual life and political life, in technology, yes, science as we know it. We have moved, to use Charles Taylor's terms, from a world of embedded religion, where beliefs and practices and assumptions about basic meanings were kind of integrated into human cultural experience. We've moved from that to a world of disembedded, separated spheres of reality. So at some point, we invented religion, which is not to say that humanity invented religion in the way that the new atheists might blithely say, but rather that we invented the concept of religion as a separate human behavior that could be easily separated from other aspects. The mythic assumption, the myth of the secular age, is that there is such a thing as the secular, which is to say normal human existence onto which this thing called religion is then kind of tacked on. Religion in the 14th century meant, for anybody who cared to think about it, the life of monks and nuns and friars, religious orders. Thus you had both religious clergy and secular clergy. Sometimes I like shocking my students by reminding them that I am a secular priest, which is kind of a weird thing to say. By the 17th century, religion meant a particular belief system. But as those belief systems became further disembedded from the institutional structures of the state, the definition has become, for most Western people today, more and more narrow. And as we know from ongoing legal battles and controversy today, religion in this country means practically something like this. Whatever area of life or thought the state is not allowed to touch. That's what religion means. And so, in effect, religion is just synonymous with the private or privacy. So debates about what is proper to religion become debates about what is properly part of the public sphere or not. Which brings us back to our quandary about that dangerous phrase, public theology. So looking back at 1833, I wonder if we might reformulate Keeble's critique in this way, that the church has begun to accept the myth of the secular. And that's kind of the problem. Once that myth is accepted, once religion becomes something that's just kind of tacked onto the kind of baseline normal human experience, it becomes very difficult to even have a conversation about it. It is by definition something superfluous. I hope it goes without saying that Keeble's dual response to the crisis remains valid. We should always pray. We should always speak the truth. These are, as I think he rightly says, simple Christian duty. But are these sufficient? Especially when it comes to the second, it strikes me as counterproductive to engage in a truth-telling campaign, even if it is calm, distinct, persevering. And actually, when you read his sermon, it is remarkably calm, for that dramatic title. But it's hard to do that when one lacks even the basic common vocabulary to speak in the public square. The Christian view of reality has been already ruled out of bounds. Even within our own Episcopal Church, I confess that I find it incredibly difficult to speak with any coherence on difficult topics. I'm sure that you can think of one or two. Not because I don't have strong views, but because we often lack common ground and common vocabulary about things. We hold different opinions about what is religious and what is secular, what is personal and public. What's a matter of truth and a matter of indifference. So that other great tractarian, John Henry Cardinal Newman, now blessed John Henry Cardinal Newman, writes, and this is number 8 on your handout, "Deductions have no power of persuasion. The heart is commonly reached not through the reason, but through the imagination, by means of direct impressions, by the testimony of facts and events, by history, by description. Persons influence us, voices melt us, looks subdue us, deeds inflame us. Many a man will live and die upon a dogma. No man will be a martyr for a conclusion." I love that quote. This could be a sort of Anglo-Catholic motto, right? I mean, it could also very well describe the impulses of Romanticism. We ritualists love our ceremony, our sights and sounds and smells, our embeddedness in history and attention to detail, our awareness of the sublime awesomeness of God's otherness, as well as our refusal to treat people and communities as concepts. And I can attest to you that the Vision Gloria still carries weight. I was so happy last year to witness the first genuine conversion of one of my students. This wasn't a kid who just kind of came back to the church or was just kind of getting confirmed like he always expected to. He was a semi-secular, semi-Buddhist Chinese American who came to St. James and fell in love with the liturgy. And after several months of soul searching, he presented himself for baptism and confirmation. Conversion is itself a kind of witness, a kind of remonstrance to the world for its indifference. And though I know all the angels in heaven rejoiced at that baptism, I wish they had more opportunities to do so. it's easy for Anglo-Catholics to pat ourselves on the back for offering a beautiful alternative to the banalities of the unliturgical world. And, this parish is a wonderful example of that. You walk in that nave and you're just kind of blown away by it. But it's easy to pat ourselves on the back for that, as if that is itself our witness. It's easy for progressive Episcopalians to pat ourselves on the back for offering a kind of inclusive model of justice. It's easy to point to the enduring success of this or that local endeavor and ignore the massive, continual decline of our own tradition as a matter of indifference. Newman's incarnational theology may be appealing for its vague romanticism, much in the same way that famous statement, falsely attributed to St. Francis, has become the motto of Christian indifferentism: preach the gospel at all times, when necessary, use words. I'm sure you've heard it. Now, I find no great fault in that statement itself, just in the way that it can be manipulated to make Christianity something other than what it is. The Christian religion, and I use that word intentionally, is neither purely an abstract relationship, nor an isolated belief, nor a pattern of good behavior, but the life devoted wholly to Jesus Christ. Last time I checked, adult human life usually involves using words and a variety of other things. There's no escape from words any more than there is an escape from behavior or institutions. And I wonder if our tendency to choose one thing over the other is just a way of escaping the inevitable and totalizing call of Christ on the individual conscience. So what I want to suggest then about the church's public witness is that there is no half-hearted way to do it. This is kind of my point. As Keeble writes, and I didn't put this quote on there, but I should have, I do not see how any person can devote himself too entirely to the cause of the apostolical church in these realms. I would suggest, like the detractors of early Methodism, back up. We would rather suggest maybe, like the detractors of early Methodism, that enthusiasm has no place in Christianity. We would rather imagine maybe that we can have all the ritual without all the doctrine, or all the doctrine without all the ritual, or all of both without any effect on our wallets or our genitals or our political and social activities. Americans are very good at piecemeal religion. It is our political birthright, founded on the myth of the secular. But there is no witness of the church without the witness of individuals. And that's the part of the Catholic revival, I think, that we contemporary ritualists love to forget, that we have to actually be holy. We have to pray. We have to obey the precepts of the church. And that word obedience is a difficult one. We have to obey the precepts of the church, like attending Mass and fasting and going to confession and tithing, all that stuff. It's amazing how much nuance we can read into these rules when we simply don't like following. The late Father Richard Cornish Martin, one of your former rectors, he used to meet with me when I was at Duke, and I remember this kind of refrain of his that seemed so simple but so hard. You just have to be a Christian. For Father Martin, like Keeble and Newman and the rest, that entailed the whole deposit of the faith, the Catholic tradition and all its deep mystery. But there's no avoiding the fact that we all have to choose it and do it and stick with it ourselves, even when it's hard and it seems we cannot possibly be on the winning side of history. We can and should try, and I'm going to try to finish up here, try to preserve and demonstrate the uniqueness of the church and her tradition. In other words, we should never worry that the church is too weird for the world. The mission of the church, as Stanley Hauerwas, my teacher, likes to say, is to show the world that it is the world, to offer an alternative. Now, I might adapt that and say that the mission of the church is to show the world that the world already is, in the terms of the modern West, religious. But for Anglo-Catholics, and I really do speak to myself here, we often imagine this in purely aesthetic terms. I dare not think of how many times I have had to confess horribly spiteful thoughts after visiting some poor other parish that fell short of the ideal. I'm always thinking like I'm comparing them to here. So when I suggest that following the Tractarians that we should be stranger or more distinctive, this can never be a merely external or aesthetic distinctiveness. We have to be strange in how we treat one another, strange in what we do with our resources, strange in how we prioritize our desires. But it's not one or the other. And this is where Anglo-Catholic witness within the church, especially the Episcopal Church, remains especially critical. The incarnational vitality of Newman and Keble requires the sacrifice of our particular causes to the integration of the whole. And just as there's no point in corporate witness without personal holiness, there's no point in personal holiness without corporate witness. In this last half century of decline and declining influence, we always want to find that one thing that we can fix. What is it? But the church is a body, and bodies aren't machines. It's not like you can just, we'll replace the prayer book and suddenly everything's great. Or you can, change the marriage canon and that fixes everything. Or you can, kick out the liberals or the conservatives and avoid all conflict. We have to think like Christians, which means resisting the myth of the secular and the fragmenting of life into things like religion that have to be attacked or defended. To have a public witness as the church, we have to have public people. And we have to practice in the church the kind of public life we expect elsewhere. So let me close with some thoughts about schools. So I say this is a school chaplain, so obviously I'm biased, but as I've moved from parish to school, that difference is of real interest to me. Schools are probably the most successful institutions in today's Episcopal Church. This doesn't mean that they're all good at Christianity. In fact, many of them seem to be very good witnesses to a kind of nondescript Unitarianism, at least a lot of the schools that I know. I say this partly because I think some of my traditionalist brethren believe that orthodoxy corresponds with growth and vitality. Would that it were so, but the schools are doing well, on the whole, regardless of their orthodoxy or lack thereof. Much better than the churches on the whole. Why? I can't prove this, but it seems obvious to me that schools, and especially boarding schools, St. James is one, thrive precisely because they resist the fragmentation of life into separate spheres of meaning. They are inherently better equipped to combat the myth of secularity. One of the things I noticed right away at St. James was the simple fact that I saw my kids, 5 to 7 days a week rather than 2 or 3 times a month at best. We eat meals together, we do sports together, we live on the same campus. And yes, we gather in chapel on average 5 to 6 times a week, not counting optional services. And at St. James we do more church than usual, but what distinguishes schools from churches is that they do not accept the redefinition of religion to merely that area outside of public influence. They are religious institutions, even when they soft-pedal that terminology, because they present and organize a whole way of life for their students. And this is by definition, being school, a way of life prone to evaluation and judgment, to accountability, and more importantly, the constant push for improvement driven by, one hopes, the love and affection of all involved. So my school still has a lot to learn about what that means, but the questions I suppose that I want to leave you with are these. Can a parish church resist the privatizing tendencies of modern religion? How can we so burnish the practice of individual and corporate holiness that it dazzles the pagan eye, to use a phrase from Paul Griffiths? Whatever we do, we have to start by ourselves refusing to accept the mythic separation of the secular and the religious, refusing to treat any theology, morality, liturgy, you name it. Nothing is a matter of indifference. It all matters. It's all part of our inheritance. Let us not, in Wordsworth's phrase, lay waste our powers and thus hide the true bride of Christ from the gaze of the world. Okay, that's it.